Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
And now, the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton, sponsored by GEHA.
Welcome to the Federal Drive on Federal News Network. It's Wednesday, June 17th. I'm your host, Terry Gerton, and I'm glad you're here. Today, we're looking at benefits, not just what they are, but whether they're working the way people think. Coming up on this hour of the Federal Drive, suicide prevention training is meant to protect service members, but the Pentagon can't fully track who's completing it or whether it's helping. Plus, life insurance is one of those benefits people tend to carry, but not always understand. Those stories and much more ahead during this hour of the Federal Drive. We begin with this. A long-awaited HR modernization program is taking a big step forward. The Office of Personnel Management has awarded a nearly $400 million contract to Oracle. The vendor is expected to deliver a government-wide IT platform to consolidate and replace the more than 100 HR systems currently in use across agencies. For the latest, Federal News Network's Drew Friedman sat down for an exclusive interview with Jason Parman, OPM's Principal Deputy Associate Director for HR Solutions, and OPM Director Scott Cooper.
What's happened over time, and this is true of a lot of what's happened in government IT, is every agency essentially has done, their own thing. Look, that makes sense in some cases, but in cases like core HR IT, which is what we're talking about here, there's way more commonality than there is bespoke need for customization here. And so for a long time, what this has meant is, number one, is we have actually 119 systems to be exact, or at least I will say that's as far as we've been able to count. Jason and team may find a few others as we go through this process. But there's a bunch of disparate systems, and there's really a number of problems with that. Number one is they actually don't talk to one another. And so every time we want to actually report on data around what's happening in the workforce or stuff, we have to actually go out and literally manually get people to pull data from systems so that we can consolidate it here at OPM so that we can then present it in a way that makes sense. What it also means is it creates all kinds of downstream problems for just managing somebody's life cycle in government. So, give you a great example. We run the retirement services operations, as Drew, you and I have talked about before, which has been fraught with all kinds of challenges over time. And one of the big challenges is if you work at different agencies over the course of your career in government, we don't have a canonical view of what your entire work history is, literally until you start to fill out a retirement application. And so our ability to kind of get that information, get you timely retirement is all kind of, gated by those types of things. And then the final thing I'll just mention is, look, it creates tremendous inefficiency. So huge inefficiencies, number one, from a spend perspective. So, we spend billions of dollars a year just on these systems alone. And then also the human capital spend is tremendous because when you talk to HR professionals, the amount of time that they tell us that they spend babysitting, outdated systems, pulling data from systems, dealing with issues that employees should be able to do from a self-service perspective, but those, systems just don't actually keep pace with what's happening. All of that just is, quite frankly, just money that's going out the door for the taxpayer.
Over the last year or so, the Trump administration has, undertaken this new effort at OPM to try to consolidate all of these systems and just create instead a unified one system for all agencies to use. Can you talk about where that effort stands right now and what the latest developments are?
When this airs, we will have just awarded a contract to a vendor who will be responsible for helping us get the system stood up and running. One might rightly ask why, we're sitting here now, 18 months into the Trump administration. Why are we now just awarding this? And I can tell you this is not for an enormous amount of effort from Jason and his team. And quite frankly, we've had lots of different people across OPM and other organizations helping us. The federal procurement process is, I would say, probably not the most efficient process that exists in the federal government. It takes a very long time to do these things. We've stood up a team, and Jason can correct me, but I think like 50 plus people we've had just on this evaluation team who have, knocked the cover off of every different technology, bell and whistle, and all the different competitor sites that have gone through and literally done days and days of demos and reviews and technical pieces and contract reviews. And, along the way also, as we kind of winnowed down the number of folks, we got a couple protests from people who didn't make the process. So that extended the process. So anyways, the good news is we're at the award stage. What that means is like the day after tomorrow, basically, Jason and his team have already started this process, but they're going to literally start fanning out to the phase one agencies who are on the list to basically be able to be the first deployment agencies for the system. And we're going to be hard at work at no longer dealing with procurement, but actually the first phase of implementation of this system.
And I do want to talk more about that phase one and how that implementation is going to start looking. But just a couple follow-up questions about the procurement process and some of those bid protests that we saw a couple months ago. Given that kind of delayed this timeline, I just kind of wanted to get an update on what your timeline for implementation is. What does that look like today? And do you expect those delays to affect the full rollout of all of this?
Yeah, so our original timeline was to try to get this done kind of in the 27 fiscal years. You can essentially take the time period that we've been delayed through this process, which we were hoping to award the contract actually in January. So call it like add plus 6 months onto that is how we think about what the current time frame looks like. We will do everything we can if there is any way to do it to bring that in. But I think, unfortunately, as these things go, you kind of, when you start to push the go button is really when we can really start to measure progress here.
Do you anticipate there being any other delays, any other potential protests along the way? And is that something that you're equipped to deal with as those come?
Well, look, we certainly don't know. It's always hard to predict these things. But look, I can tell you the team has done an incredibly thorough process. So again, this has been going on for a very long period of time. As I mentioned, we had more than 50 people who just literally almost all they've done for the last 9 months or so has been to kind of, make sure there's a level playing field, both on the commercial side, on the technical side. So look, that's out of our hands. What we're committed to doing is we've been using this delay that we had to make sure that all the prep work that we could do with all the agencies is up and running. So, our hope is to be able to actually deliver on behalf of the American taxpayers. If things come up that delay that, obviously, look, we'll deal with it as they come, but I'm highly confident in the work the team has done and our ability to successfully defend any challenges to this process.
And as you're kind of starting through this, the onboarding process, you mentioned phase one. Can you talk about, next steps now after this contract is awarded? Who are those agencies that are going to be starting with this, and what's that initial transition going to look like?
Yeah, glad to weigh in here. So, Drew, I appreciate the question. And as Scott said, the work has already begun, right? We're pressing the go button with a selected vendor. And our very first order of business is onboarding that vendor and then configuring a federal platform, configuring one version of truth, one version of capability for the federal government. This will realize all of the benefits that Scott was saying, right? Rather than 119 different versions of the same data field or the same capability. We are at OPM, which really should be in the center of this ecosystem, right? Going to account for agency-specific flexibilities, but also drive the kind of standardization consistency across the federal employee and practitioner experience so that we can roll out this federally configured instance of our selected vendor. So that's the very next work to do. Simultaneously, we'll really be ramping up our efforts with the vendor partner and with our Wave 1 agencies on data migration. We've already done quite a bit of work with data migration playbooks, agency readiness, preparation handbooks that we've been working with all of our agencies, but especially those who will go first. And so, as Scott said, hitting the go button enables us to then leverage that vendor partner, which will have all of their demonstrated capabilities, all of our fit gap requirements, worked out, and all those configurations ready so that agencies can effectively and rapidly transition to the new platform.
And can you talk about, just from more of a practical perspective, what are the things that are going to be available on this platform? What are HR professionals or employees going to see when they use this?
Yeah, so as a longtime career HR practitioner myself, I sometimes joke that while I've been here a long time, certain experiences as an HR practitioner are very much like they were 30 years ago when I started. And this is exactly what we intend to improve. So as an HR practitioner, we're asked to make impactful enterprise level workforce strategy decisions and inform strategic decisions from leadership. And that's based on data that we have to go out and get. And from OPM's perspective, that often takes months. We get incomplete, inconsistent responses, things like that. I mean, imagine if you asked one workforce-related question and you got 119 slightly different variations of the same answer. It takes people, it takes money, and it takes time. And it disallows us from making decisions about the workforce we have now, or, dare I even dream, the workforce we might envision having in the near future. Now replace that with what we intend to do from the HR practitioner standpoint, and those questions are answerable in real time from a single platform and a single dashboard or a single set of decision-informing data that we can view and help make enterprise strategy decisions at scale and quickly. So that's transformative for the day-to-day business of the HR practitioner. But as anyone who's ever worked in any large organization realizes, HR is that underpinning foundation of kind of all of our basic needs as employees. If we get married, if we have a life change event, we need to make sure our insurance changes appropriately. We need to make sure we're getting paid appropriately in the right spot, things like that. And too often, even if we stay at the same agency, those decisions, those processes have toil involved, have lots of human interaction, and sometimes even have paper. And heaven forbid then we should take our skills to the private sector and back, or to another agency. And now we have an entire other set of records because they don't automatically follow us seamlessly. And that just compounds the complexity and degrades the experience of the federal employee or someone who wants to work with or for the federal government or who's serviced by the federal government. So fast forward to when we have this unified platform, and now that record follows the employee seamlessly, no matter how many times we go in or out of government, no matter which agencies we go to. And so not only does that reduce toil, reduce human capital expense, and increase that employee's experience, but I don't think it's unfair to say then you're freed up to do more of that mission critical work that ultimately is going to benefit those who receive services from the federal government, those who receive benefits from the federal government. And I think it improves the experience for all of us. I see a tremendous improvement in both the lives of the HR practitioner at the federal level, but also all of those communities that the HR practitioner impacts.
I would just say the other piece to me that's very exciting about this is think of this as this becomes the centerpiece for how we create effectively a unified set of applications that every federal employee can follow from literally, I mean, I hate to use the term, but from cradle to grave, right? So, right now we have disparate systems for HR, we have disparate systems for, health insurance signups, for life insurance, for retirement, for, everything you need to do in your life cycle change. So you can imagine a smart system where in the future, I get married, for example, and so I need to go into the HR system and update my marital status. Well, that tells me then, do you want to add that person to your health insurance? Well, of course I do, because it now knows that. Or, by the way, do you know when you retire, you might need to add this person as a beneficiary? Do you want us to update your beneficiary files in retirement? Like, the opportunities are endless, but what this does is basically drive an enormous amount of kind of self-service and more importantly, the ability for us to actually kind of be able to make the employee experience much more seamless.
One thing I am curious about with this whole effort is if you look historically with efforts to implement different major IT or tech systems through this kind of single system awards, like, for example, the Defense Department's HR system, FBI's Sentinel system, there have been unsuccessful efforts over time to take on these huge, massive government-wide projects. Can you talk about what you've learned and just the prep work you've done here, maybe looking back at the past 6 months or so, that you think puts OPM in a good position to make this successful?
So yes, look, we have tried to be students of history as much as we can here and understand exactly where the pitfalls are. So I think there's a couple things. Number one is, look, some of this is just institutional inertia problem, which is, look, the government is a very decentralized set of organizations. One of the big priorities, as you know, from this administration has been to say, hey, look, where it makes sense for centralization, we want to see it happening. We want to see you leveraging the purchase power heft of the United States government on behalf of the taxpayer. And so we didn't go, kind of imagine this in isolation. Jason and team and many of us spent a bunch of time with the White House, particularly with the Office of Management Budget, OMB, and all the various agencies. When you talk to the agencies, everyone's like, yeah, this is a total no-brainer, right? I mean, it's obvious we should do it. Now, that doesn't necessarily make it any easier to take on a task of this Herculean size. But really, number one is we did a great job, I think, of kind of, priming the pump with all the agencies and then working with OMB specifically, because as you can imagine, from a financial perspective, to make this work, you're going to have people, running their old systems for a while we're implementing their new systems, which means they have to have extra money in a given, time period to cover effectively double billing until we decommission the old system. So there's a little bit of kind of orchestration there that we've been very, very pleased to have great partnership with OMB on. I think the other thing that we've done well is also recognized, and again, Jason can talk about this more specifically, that there's always this strong desire for customization, right? This is where I think these problems all go awry, is you have customization, and then, oh, by the way, typically you have a third party, consulting firm that is kind of managing the process. And so we've done, I think, two things that are going to, serve us very well. One is we've put in place a bunch of kind of committees that represent the major players in the industry to make sure we have, a data governance committee and a security committee and things like that sort, so that there aren't any going to be kind of random actors who could ultimately kind of introduce requirements and challenges that will obviously make it harder for us. And two is we decided to kind of insource to ourselves, to the human resources group that Jason is a part of, the entire implementation and migration process. So obviously we'll be working with the kind of software vendor that we picked, but we're not hiring an outside SI basically to run this process. And it's nothing against outside SIs, but I think what that means is we singularly, through Jason and the 130 person team that kind of many of whom exist, but we're also augmenting that team. We are going to be the internal SI. And so we've got no incentive other than how quickly and with the highest quality can we get this done. There's no adverse, selection impact here, where the longer that Jason and his team can bill, the more money somebody makes from a profit perspective. So we've really tried to kind of attack it from all those angles.
Well, I would only add, Scott, that just two quick things. One is, we talk about mission critical work across government, and the government has done historically a really good job dividing mission critical work. You want to safeguard parks, that's the National Park Service. Well, the U.S. Office of Personnel Management's mission is human capital management. And so this really does represent the first time in the federal space where OPM has kind of assertively taken on that centralized role of configurator, but also both deliverer and governor of the best practices, the best data definitions, things like that. And so I would mention that a key difference here is OPM has assertively organizationally aligned both the delivery resources and the governance resources in a way in which it really just has unlocked, I think, efficiency and the ability to do things that we just simply couldn't do before at OPM. The partnership with OMB has been critical. The support from the administration has been absolutely essential, because we've just really never seen anything like that before at OPM. But by putting, I'm also the program executive for the Human Resources Quality Services Management Office, or HRQSMO, which helps govern the HRIT marketplace in government. And so what we're really doing here is we're setting a one-item marketplace for this foundational technology that will get everyone speaking from the same platform. And that then allows us to build a complete ecosystem, as Scott was saying, based on the very best the private sector has to offer, and where appropriate in-sourced capabilities, so that not just personnel action processing, benefits processing, things like that is streamlined and made more consistent, but we can make more the entire experience across the HR lifecycle. So I think that's a key differentiator, is aligning organizationally both the governance resources and the delivery resources.
Yeah, the incentive structure is very simple, Drew, which is basically our job is we got to deliver the highest quality customer experience at the lowest possible cost. There's no daylight between what we want and what every other agency wants. And so we're just going to keep plowing forward.
And you mentioned that you have, some working groups. You've been involved with kind of working with agencies on, ironing out some of the prep work here. Can you talk about, now that you have the vendor and you're going to be working on onboarding there, how are you going to keep different HR professionals, agencies, other stakeholders involved as this process moves forward?
We have basically divided all of our work streams appropriately into kind of these subdomains of content. And we have active working groups and, in fact, 2 different governing bodies riding herd over this entire project. So if you're concerned about data definitions and data quality, things like that, we've got a work group for you. We have a multi-agency team representative of the entire federal government, actively working on our security protocols and our security certifications, because that's absolutely critical, obviously, to an enterprise platform like this. So in every kind of subcomponent area, we've got active working groups that are engaging all of the largest agencies, but also all of the councils, all the XO councils, CXO, CIO, CMO, and the small agency councils. So we're taking feedback from everywhere we can. We're aggregating that, and then we're making good, informed, but also collaborative decisions on the configurations of the platform and on the rollout schedule, things like that.
When are you looking to have these Wave 1 agencies done? When does Wave 2 start? Can you give me a sense of, how this is going to proceed?
So we will spend a few months right up front configuring that federal instance, and then we intend to begin moving out with pace, because those agencies will be prepared for migration. We'll have a detailed migration strategy in place. You'll start to see Wave 1 agencies come on absolutely in the early parts of FY27, and I don't want to make any promises with my boss on this call, but maybe even a couple before that. We're optimistic about what we've seen thus far, what we've evaluated with the platform capabilities, and our ability to configure and deploy this at scale with speed.
Taking a bigger picture approach here, just to wrap up, this HR IT consolidation effort is part of the broader HR 2.0 plan at OPM. Can you talk about if there have been any other updates within that larger initiative? For example, I know you guys have the new HR Shared Service Center. Anything else you can give me about where you see things going from here?
I can't announce specific customer agency names yet, but what I can tell you is we will have our first very, very significant kind of set of new customers coming on board to that Shared Services Center, I believe, as we also go into the new fiscal year. So think of that as, October calendar, but, 27 fiscal year of this year. So we've stood that up. We've got a team who's working on that. And again, I think the future of this is incredible, because what we're trying to do with everything is just say, hey, look, centralization for the sake of centralization doesn't make any sense. The question is, what function specifically do we think that OPM actually has the subject matter domain expertise to do better than anyone else? And also, can we do it at a much more efficient scale than everybody else? So this first instance that you're going to see us stand up here in the fall is going to be the first significant kind of customer migration that we'll have to the new Shared Service Center.
I'm from the services side originally, and then have spent a long time in IT as well. So I'm just incredibly excited for our federal HR community across the government, but I am incredibly excited for the impacts we're going to have just on the everyday federal worker and on those who come in contact with federal workers. We're getting ready to do better with less kind of toil and strife, and that will translate to just a better experience and increased efficiencies. I'm stoked. This is going to be great.
That's OPM Director Scott Cooper and OPM's Principal Deputy Associate Director for HR Solutions, Jason Parman. They're speaking there with Federal News Network's Drew Friedman. You can find Drew's full story at federalnewsnetwork.com.
Tune in Tuesdays at 10:30 a.m. and 2:30 p.m. for the Innovation in Government Show, sponsored by Carasoft. Hear from the industry leaders advancing the technologies shaping how agencies modernize secure operations and deliver better services. Innovation in Government covers what is changing now, what is working from cybersecurity and cloud to data, AI, and emerging technologies. Listen to Innovation in Government, Tuesdays at 10:30 a.m. and 2:30 p.m. on Federal News Network. Search Innovation in Government.
Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Suicide prevention depends on reaching people early, but the military doesn't always have a clear visibility into whether its training is being completed or making a difference. A recent GAO review highlights gaps that go beyond compliance. We hear more from Rashmi Agarwal, Director of Defense Capabilities and Management at GAO. Ms. Agarwal, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me.
We have a tough topic to talk about, military suicides. We hear a lot about veteran suicides, which, as of the latest data, are still averaging more than 17 a day. Your report, though, focuses on the active duty force and what DoD is doing to provide suicide prevention training. How big of a problem is suicide in the active duty force?
Thanks, Terry. So suicide among active duty service members still remains a significant concern. DoD last reported in its report that 471 service members as of 2024 died by suicide. So while that is a slight decrease from 2023, rates of suicide have generally increased over the past decade. So this is definitely still a concern for the military.
And what is the Department of Defense's strategy around suicide prevention training? How do they go about it?
So each of the services have their own specific training for their service members. So the Army has its training, the Navy, the Marine Corps, the Air Force, and this is done annually. So there's annual required suicide prevention training that the services implement that they're required to track over the course of the year.
So they have a requirement to conduct it, but your report indicates that DoD really doesn't have any idea how effective that is, whether it's actually been accomplished. Tell us about what you found.
So, there's different layers of review in terms of, determining whether or not, first of all, even whether or not service members even completed the suicide prevention training. So I'll start with the top layer. So there is a Defense Suicide Prevention Office. That office has general responsibility for suicide prevention efforts across the department. However, they are not receiving the information department-wide about whether or not suicide prevention training has been completed across the services. So without that information, DoD lacks visibility into whether service members are actually receiving the training intended to help them connect with resources, identify risk factors, and get support that they need. Going down one level, at the headquarters level, the individual services often rely on local commanders and units to manage compliance with suicide prevention training rather than conducting central monitoring at the headquarters level. So there's the Defense Suicide Prevention Office, which has general oversight, and then there's the individual services, the headquarters services offices, and they are really relying on the commanders and the units.
Is this a systems problem? It's just hard to get data all the way back? Is it a prioritization problem? What's the core issue in terms of being able to manage accountability for this really important training?
So I think it's really a management problem. It's really getting the information up to a central entity to have oversight of suicide prevention training across the department. So the DISPO just doesn't have the information it needs. It doesn't have the data it needs to consistently determine whether or not suicide prevention training has been completed from the military services. Several of the service headquarter offices told us they largely view training completion as a commander responsibility at the unit level. So what that means is that responsibility is decentralized and there's no single entity that has a complete picture of suicide prevention training completion across the department.
I'm speaking with Rashmi Agarwal. She's Director, Defense Capabilities and Management at GAO. Rashmi, one of the other things that caught my eye in your report is that they really don't have an understanding inside DoD of whether they're actually even conducting the right kind of training. They don't have any way to assess the value of the training content itself. What did you find there?
So what's really largely missing is a structured evaluation of the training. So some of the services, they were using surveys or collecting other participant feedback, but we found that they generally have not developed comprehensive evaluation plans that link the training activities to their intended outcomes. So effective evaluation would include, for example, specific short, intermediate, long-term outcomes. They would establish performance measures, assess whether or not the training is actually improving knowledge of service members, including recognition of suicide risk factors. So without that structured evaluation, the department really cannot reliably determine whether that the training is actually achieving its intended objectives.
And you all made 17 recommendations in this report. You've made recommendations in this area before. Now there are 17 fresh ones. Walk us through the top level ones that you would want DoD to certainly prioritize first.
Well, first is definitely getting the information to suicide prevention office in terms of making sure that data is coming up from the unit commanders to the headquarters service level offices, and then that information rolling up to DISPO so that they have complete oversight of to what extent suicide prevention training is occurring department-wide. The other set of recommendations is then really targeted at the individual headquarters service level offices conducting the types of evaluations that they need to make sure that the training objectives are being met. How well is the training actually meeting intended outcomes? And then the last set of the recommendations that we made is really focused on going forward. So back in January of 2023, the department had stood up a suicide prevention and response independent review committee that looked at suicide prevention generally across the department. And they had issued a report in January of 2023 with 117 recommendations, 18 of which were focused specifically on non-clinical suicide prevention training. And so our recommendation is getting at to what extent the department is changing its plans or making iterative plans to being able to implement those 18 recommendations given changes going on in the department. So things like changes in staffing and then changes in how they plan to deliver that training going forward.
How has the Pentagon responded to your recommendations?
So DoD agreed with 9 recommendations. They partially agreed with 6 recommendations, and they disagreed with 2. One area of the disagreement involved requiring the services to report the training completion data to DoD's Central Suicide Prevention Office. We continue to believe that that recommendation is valid because DoD needs reliable data to oversee training and make informed decisions. We also maintain that regular updating of implementation plans for future suicide prevention training efforts is important given ongoing organizational changes as well as staffing changes.
The report does say GAO is uncertain. I love those kind GAO words, uncertain, that DoD will be able to continue these efforts, as you mentioned, giving recent staffing levels and a pending decision on combining suicide prevention training with other trainings. Tell me more about that.
So the department is doing a re-examination of the various trainings that they have across the department and really determining which trainings are in alignment with their current objectives and priorities. So what they have done is they're making an evaluation whether or not to combine certain trainings together, so including suicide prevention training, combining it with other trainings. And, there have been changes in staffing. As you know, the department has undergone a number of cuts in the civilian workforce, and so making sure that they have the staffing needed in order to be able to implement these trainings going forward.
And if DoD were to make this a key priority and really tackle the challenges that you've laid out here, how would that translate to better outcomes over time?
I think it would be a combination of factors. So it would be improved tracking and evaluation. So better data would mean better data and better oversight would mean that would create a visibility into completion of suicide prevention training across the services. And if there was leadership attention, that would signal organizational priority to suicide prevention. I think GAO specifically recommended requiring the services to report completion data, improving the headquarters monitoring, developing the evaluation plans, and strengthening project management. And it's the combination of those actions that would create the conditions for informed decision making and sustained accountability going forward.
And we might hope that better training while they're on active duty carries over into their life post-service, and we can get the veteran suicide rate down as well.
Yes, while we didn't look at that correlation between active duty service and their transition to veteran status with regards to suicide prevention training, theoretically that would make sense that, the information that they're getting while they're in active duty would resonate and carry over as they transition over to veteran status.
Rashmi Agarwal is Director of Defense Capabilities and Management at GAO. Thank you so much for joining me, and thanks for sharing this really important report with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
We'll post this interview and a link to the report at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Listen to the Federal Drive on your schedule. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Still to come, this program is being pitched as a simple way to build wealth early, but whether it works may depend on how well it fits real life. But first, life insurance is one of those benefits people tend to carry, but they don't always understand how it really works. You're listening to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. A lot of people have life insurance, but that doesn't always mean they know what it's meant to cover or whether it would actually do what they expect. For federal employees, those questions often start with FEGLI and follow them into retirement. Here to help us sort through some key decision points is Tammy Flanagan, Principal at Retire Federal. Tammy, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thanks, Terry. It's great to be back.
I really appreciate that you agreed to talk to me today about life insurance. I think when it comes to this topic, a lot of people think they're supposed to have it, but they don't know what they're supposed to do. I looked at some survey data from June 2025 from the National Association of Insurance and Financial Advisors, and they say 41% of adults say they are only somewhat or not at all knowledgeable about life insurance, and 75% have no idea what it should cost. So let's start there. What is life insurance? It's not car or home insurance. What is it supposed to do?
Yeah, and it's also not necessarily long-term care insurance, because a lot of people will tell me, well, I have life insurance. I don't need long-term care. And there are some long-term care policies included with life insurance. But when it boils down to the basics, there's really only two kinds of life insurance. One is called term insurance, and the other one is either whole life or cash value. And so the term insurance is what most people need and purchase because, number one, it's cheaper than whole life. And number two, most of us have a finite need for a lot of life insurance. It's mostly when we have the most financial responsibility to others, whether it's our spouse or children, maybe parents even. But it's whenever we have to worry about if something happens to me, who's going to raise these kids or who's going to pay off the mortgage, and making sure I'm leaving my family with some level of comfort financially.
So when we think about other kinds of insurance, home insurance, auto insurance, you think about replacing that asset in case of a loss. Well, you can't obviously replace a life in case of a loss. So what is life insurance really doing from a financial perspective?
It's replacing the income. So in other words, if I'm working and I'm the breadwinner of my family, I want to make sure that when that income stops, if I should die, or think in terms of disability insurance, if I should become disabled, how is that income going to still come in when I'm not able to produce it? So, you can't necessarily buy enough life insurance to replace that full income unless you get, extraordinary amounts. But for some people, as much as you can afford is what you need.
And you mentioned term and whole life. What are the differences between those two options?
Well, term insurance, as the name implies, it's for a specific term. So you've heard of 20-year term policies or even sometimes 30-year term policies, which means if I buy that policy today and it's a 20-year level term, that means for the next 20 years, I'm going to have that level of insurance, the amount that I just purchased. And in most cases, that premium is going to stay the same for the entire term of the policy. Now, some of those term policies are called renewable term, which is a little bit deceiving because you think, oh, it's renewable. So after 20 years, I'll decide if I need more and I'll just renew it. Well, the only thing that really means is I don't have to pass the medical underwriting anymore, but the price is not going to be what I've been paying for the last 20 years. In fact, you probably won't want to renew much of that policy if you wait 20 years to check the premiums. So that's what we normally buy. In fact, that's kind of what our government life insurance is. It's not level term, but it doesn't have cash value. So it'd be more similar to a term policy than whole life. Whole life by the term is cash value. So that means I'm paying a policy premium, which is fairly high. But if I need the money at some point, I can take out the cash value. When I pass away, even if I live to be 98 years old, there's still going to be some insurance benefit payable to my beneficiary. So there's some extra benefits to that, but you certainly pay for those benefits.
Tammy Flanagan is principal with Retire Federal. Tammy, let's go back now and talk specifically about federal employees. They have FEGLI. What is FEGLI from a policy perspective, and how should people be thinking about it across the course of their career?
I always remember one time I was teaching a class, and this woman said to me, we were talking about FEGLI and life insurance, and she said, "You're telling me that I don't need life insurance anymore and I might be able to cancel this?" She says, "But I didn't get my money's worth. I paid all this money and I got nothing to show for it." And I had to think about that. And I'm like, well, you really don't want to get your money's worth out of any insurance when it comes right down to it. But in a way, it did serve the purpose, because while you had it, and fortunately you're still here, but if something should have happened to you, it would have protected your children or your family to help replace some of the income that you have. And that's really what FEGLI is designed for. In fact, when FEGLI started, it was really designed to cover people who went off to war. Federal employees who were going into World War II and maybe didn't come back, it protected their families. So that was really what the emphasis was on starting government group term life insurance. But today, most employees carry, if nothing else, the basic. And the nice thing about basic FEGLI is it floats with your salary. So every time you get a pay increase, the level of that insurance goes up. And the price of it stays at the same price per thousand throughout your career. It's 16 cents per thousand biweekly, which if you're 25 years old, that's expensive. But if you're 65 years old, that's a pretty darn good rate for life insurance. So what FEGLI does is for people 35 years old and younger, the death benefit is double your salary. And then if you're between 35 and 45, that goes down 10% every year until at age 45 and beyond. It's always valued at your current salary, rounded up to the next 1,000 plus 2,000. So most employees keep that, maintain it. I never generally recommend dropping basic life because it has some other benefits to it. It has something called a living benefit, which I just told somebody about last week because this is a woman who's in her 50s, diagnosed terminal. Unfortunately, she got a really dreaded prognosis. And FEGLI says that if you have a life expectancy of 9 months or less, you can become your own beneficiary, which in her case is going to come in handy because she's out of leave. She's facing leave without pay. She's trying to decide what to do next, and she needs the money to replace her salary since she can't work. So that's going to come in real handy with, in her case, $200,000 worth of basic life at her access with no taxes because it's a life insurance proceed. So that's one benefit. The second benefit of basic life is when you retire, if you elect the 75% reduction, there's different options, but if you elect that one, once you reach age 65, you stop paying the premiums, yet the coverage will remain at 25% of its original value for the rest of your life. And sometimes we kind of jokingly refer to that as funeral coverage or burial policy because what's left is always going to help to cover those final expenses. And it generally comes within 2 weeks of applying for it. So it's a pretty quick turnaround.
So Tammy, as feds are thinking about retirement, how should they be thinking about FEGLI? Should they be thinking about replacing it with a private product, self-insuring? What are the considerations that you recommend people take on board?
Yeah, the basic life, like I said, put that aside. It's something I would not recommend dropping because it has some hidden benefits. The option B coverage is where you can elect multiples of your salary, up to 5 times your salary. And when you're young, starting a family, buying a house, that might be when you need 5 times your salary plus the basic. But what happens over time with option B is it gets really expensive. Between the ages of 50 and 60, it more than doubles in price. And during those 10 years is usually when I get the most questions about, why do I need this? Look how much it's costing me every 2 weeks. Can I drop it? Can I reduce it? And the answer is yes, you can do both. You can either reduce the multiples or drop it all together. But really, the time to reconsider that is not in your 50s. It's in your 30s and 40s when you're still really insurable and you can go out and buy a term policy for a lot less than that total cost of FEGLI over the next 20 years. And so I would suggest looking at term insurance if you're insurable. And FEGLI over time gets real expensive, so therefore it's a good comparison. The only time I would say option B is a really good deal is if you're not insurable, because every federal employee has the option to elect FEGLI coverage either when they're hired or when there's a life event, they get married, they have a child, they go through a divorce, you can increase that FEGLI with no questions about your health. And that's really a real benefit for someone who has pre-existing health problems.
So for somebody right now who's looking at their insurance premium, or maybe we've provoked someone to go, well, I really should go look at what my life insurance is. What are the most important things they need to think about right now to assess whether they have the right or sufficient coverage?
Well, you got to figure out how much life insurance you need, right? So you're trying to think in terms of, if something happened to me, who is going to be at a loss for that income? Do I have children that are still being cared for? Do I have a spouse who doesn't have other sources of income to support themselves? Did I just buy a house with a big mortgage? So you really have to assess your needs first and foremost. And then you have to figure out what the best kind of insurance to purchase. We talked about term life, we talked about whole life, and then there's FEGLI. So which one of those is really going to meet those needs? Or maybe it's a combination. Maybe with the limitations of FEGLI, that's not enough. So I'm going to buy my FEGLI coverage, and then I'm going to supplement it with a private term policy during those years of the biggest need. So you have to give it some thought, maybe talk with your financial advisor if you're working with one, because they can generally give you quotes on a lot of different insurance companies to help you look at the different types of insurance and the different policy rates.
Tammy Flanagan is a principal with Retire Federal. Tammy, this has been so helpful. Thank you so much for joining me.
You're welcome, Terry. Thank you so much for having me.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Hear the Federal Drive on demand. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Coming up next, this program is being pitched as a simple way to build wealth early, but whether it works may depend on how it fits real life. This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. So-called Trump accounts are being described as a way to give kids an early start on savings. But the real questions are how much value they deliver and where they actually fit among the choices families already have. Here to help us sort out the considerations is the president of Armed Forces Mutual, Mike Meese. Mike, thanks so much for joining me today.
Happy to be here, Terry.
We are at the beginning of summer, and there's a lot of events coming up for the 250th Independence Day celebrations. Something else that happens on the 4th of July, though, is the start of the new Trump accounts for children. There's certainly been a lot of buzz about those accounts, but maybe not a lot of information. So you are the person who's going to break all that down for us. Let's start from the beginning. What are these Trump accounts intended to do?
Great question, Terry. And we've had a lot of this question from our American Armed Forces mutual aid members, and so we've had to answer it for them. The Trump accounts were established last summer as part of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, and it creates essentially like a traditional IRA for children that are under 18, and it has a special provision that those children that are born in 2025 through 2028 will get an automatic contribution of $1,000 from the federal government. So it's really a unique, new kind of individual retirement account like savings vehicle.
You described them as an IRA style account for kids, but in practical terms, how should people be thinking about them when deciding whether or not to use them?
Well, you want to think about it kind of like a traditional IRA, in that traditional IRAs, the money that is in there grows tax deferred. And then at the point when the child turns 18, that money becomes their money. And when they take it out, they pay taxes on it. And so it's really on the $1,000 that they might get from the federal government, plus many other companies may match that money. The children would end up paying taxes on that, and the growth in those accounts when they take that money out for a qualified expense. Right now, they're talking about qualified expenses being education, first-time home buying, and a business formation.
So that $1,000 government contribution gets a lot of attention. You just mentioned it's limited to children born between certain years. If you have a 5-year-old, for example, they're not going to get that $1,000, right?
That's exactly right. The statisticians tell me that there will be actually 14 million babies born in 2025 through 2028. So that literally is $14 billion that the Treasury could potentially put into Trump accounts. And then the government would tax that 18 years later when those children turn 18 and they take the money out for one of the qualified purposes. Now, for anybody else, like I have grandchildren that we love, but they happen to have been born before 2025, you can still have that traditional Trump account, and you can put in up to $5,000 a year. The money that will be in there is tax deferred as it grows, and then people would pay taxes on any of the earnings once they take that money out. So it's different than other kinds of savings plans.
Let's call your statisticians back to the stage. If you get $1,000 free from the government to initiate your child's Trump account, what value might that have 18 years from now?
Again, the concept is it's going to be invested in the market. And if you think of an average return of 6 or 7%, which is what would happen on average in the stock market, by the time the child turns 18, that would be about $3,400, even if you put absolutely no additional money into that and it was getting the average return from the market. So that's a pretty good return, again, with no other contributions from you.
Mike Meese is president of Armed Forces Mutual. Mike, this sounds like a universal program, but is it open to everybody, or are there limits on who can participate?
You have to be a child under 18, and you have to have a Social Security number here in the United States in order to be able to participate. But other than those relatively modest restrictions, anybody can participate. The maximum contribution is $5,000 per year. And many employers have also said that they would help make the contribution so that, for example, if you contributed $2,500, your employer may match up to $2,500 to be able to help children get a head start on their savings.
That's a pretty significant contribution. How should families factor that in as they're thinking about their financial planning?
Well, the first thing is, if your employer or if the federal government will give you the free money, it's almost unequivocally a good idea to do that. On the other hand, if the child is not born during this time frame or your employer will not match the contributions, you would probably want to compare that with other tax-advantaged vehicles. For example, there's the 529 plans, which is a college savings plan in which also grows tax-deferred. The big difference between a 529 plan and the Trump plan is when the money comes out of the 529, if it's used for qualified educational expenses, there's no tax on any of that growth. And that's kind of the key difference between the two, is the taxation at the other end 18 years from now.
And do families have any say over how their account will be invested, or is that all handled institutionally?
Right now, a lot of that information is yet to be forthcoming. Right now, you can download the Trump accounts. There's an app that has been developed, Department of the Treasury app, but there's not a lot of information about where that's going to be invested or how that's going to be invested. Experts who have taken a look at it are going to have said that it's going to be kind of similar to the thrift savings plan in that it's a very efficient indexed ETF type fund where it's going to be invested to hopefully get most of the market returns.
And so many families are already thinking about how to make investment decisions. Perhaps parents are still investing for their own retirement. How should they be balancing this kind of investment with their own long-term retirement planning?
Well, you can always get loans for college. You can always get loans for a home. Nobody's going to give you a loan for your own retirement. So if I was advising somebody, I would say, look at your own retirement first. Take a look at things like 401ks and Roth IRAs first for your own retirement. And then if you've got additional funds, perhaps putting that into a 529 for a child, or contributing to a new Trump account for a child would be something that may be a consideration. But after you focus on your retirement savings, your emergency funds, and then as an additional tool for you.
You've said a couple of times that the rules aren't really fleshed out on this just yet. Maybe you're having a new baby and you just don't want to miss this window for a free $1,000, but should people kind of hold out on this for a little bit and wait to see what the rules are before they start this up?
Yeah, like many of the things, if you, it's fine to download the app right now. Take a look at it. When you download that, you'll see there's a lot of to be completed information and a lot more information out there. And then I would not necessarily advise people to on July 4th or July 5th to try to deposit money. My guess is, like any new program, it'll take a little bit of time to be able to do that. You can fill out the form and then start to open the account to be sure that money is there, but it's going to take a little while for that to be implemented. And there's also no rush to do it in early July or something like that. You've got plenty of time to be able to do that.
So if you're a federal employee now or a military family listening to this, what would you want to make sure you have in place and you've considered before you're sure that either this is a smart move for you and your family, or maybe it just doesn't make any sense at all?
Well, I think the key is do some research yourself. If you've got a financial advisor, we have a lot of people asking us here at Armed Forces Mutual for advice on that. And they, professional financial advisors, can give you a little bit better perspective on how this fits in with your overall tax planning. In my case, for example, my grandchildren weren't born during this time frame. It makes sense for me to use a 529 plan. In that case, the 529 plan, when the children take it out for educational expenses, they take that out without paying taxes on it. And I actually get a benefit here in the state of Virginia. Anything that I contribute to that comes off of my taxes. That would not be true for the Trump account. So definitely check with a financial advisor, do some of your own research, and keep up to date on the information as it comes out this summer.
Mike Mace is president of Armed Forces Mutual. Mike, I really appreciate you joining us and bringing this to our attention. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Terry.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Hear the Federal Drive on demand. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton is produced by Eric White and Michelle Sandiford. Our web editor is Stephanie Wright. For the latest updates, stay with federalnewsnetwork.com or follow us on Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. I'm Terry Gerton. Thanks for listening.